Okay, so this is integrating the God archetype. So it's the 8th of this series of talks and discussions on archetypes and the middle way, in the middle way network. And we've been working our way through 4 functional archetypes in the last 3 sessions. So 3 other functional archetypes. So we've talked in the last few sessions about the hero, the shadow, and the anima animus, all of which I've been seeing as forms of inspiration. So particularly thinking about how we can practically connect to these different archetypes as symbols. So they may take a variety of different symbolic forms. But the way I see a helpful practice with these is to be inspired by them without projecting them. So exactly the same applies to this 4th and perhaps final or capping functional archetype, the God archetype. And you might say the big daddy of the archetypes, or maybe the big mummy, if you could be non-sexist about it. Okay, so the now the very use of the word God often creates a lot of polarized responses. Just the word God, before we get into any explanations of what we mean or how we're using this word, but it's worth I think it's worth using that word if for no other reason that we do have these strong responses to it quite often, whether pro or con. So it's good to try and recognize that and integrate those responses. So whatever it is, it probably gives you something to work with, the use of the word. Yeah, so I will explain more about why I'm using the word God. The approach to the God archetype I'm going to take here starts like all the other approaches to archetypes with embodied meaning, and with a distinction between meaning and belief. So we'll be exploring the meaning of God and related symbols that perform the same function for us, inspirational function. So the meaning of God or similar symbols as an archetype. So that's not going to involve any belief in God or beliefs about God particularly, or indeed disbeliefs or negations of beliefs. Indeed, I'd probably actively discourage or try to discourage such beliefs. We'll see later. So we also need to bear in mind something I've been saying several times in this series, that archetypes are crucially different from symbols. So the God archetype describes inspirational function in our experience. And all sorts of symbols with all sorts of labels on them should perform that function. Some of the most common ones, which might do it for you, are reality, truth, enlightenment, and nature. I'll say more about those later on. So what I'm looking at in any of those really is ways that they can do the same inspirational job, if you like, as God can do, or the ideal symbol of God can do. So those other symbols could, if you prefer, just as easily provide the name of the archetype. You could call it the reality archetype, the enlightenment archetype, whatever you want. So it's not, don't get hung up on the name, because it's the name of an archetype, not the name of a symbol. But you have to call it something. And to me, it seems the most widespread and powerful name for it, particularly in West. Maybe in Far East, we might have a different experience. I don't know, but all of us here are Westerners. Maybe some Easterners will watch this. I don't know, but probably this talk is mainly directed towards people who will have some sort of theistic background or post-theistic background, or live in societies that have God as some major feature. So yeah, all of these are part of the background, if you like, as to what the title means. So when we get to engaging with the God archetype, we also need to bear in mind the ways that it builds up from the other archetypes. So we've been talking in the previous weeks about the hero, the shadow, and the animus. Any of these really can transform themselves or develop into the God archetype. So if you like, you could see the hero, the shadow, and the anima animus as kind of stalks from which the flower of the God archetype emerges, something like that. Basically, the God archetype function tends to take over as we integrate any of these other archetypes. So if we think about the hero, for example, the hero is focused on goals, and I talked about having goals and persevering in those goals, but also integrating those goals. That's what the hero can inspire us to do. So as our goals become more integrated, they become more provisionally understood. We adapt ourselves as well as the goal, if you like. We adapt to it as well as it to us. And the means to the end becomes more flexible. So maybe we started off trying to win, but we ended up making peace, and we gradually expanded the peace we wanted to make. So the hero, the goals of the hero can expand into something that starts to look very like the God archetype. And we tend to find this with religious heroes that become God or are associated with God, like Christ or like the Buddha. Then the shadow. So again, if you think the shadow is about our responses to threats and trying to separate genuine threats from unnecessary anxiety, integrating our responses to threats, and mobilizing deeper resources against genuine threats as opposed to fake ones. So the more we do that, the more we mobilize our deeper resources, if you like, the more we're likely to connect with the God archetype. In other words, we see the shadow in a wider context of integrative potential. Satan traditionally has this close relationship with God. He's just the flip side of God in some ways. He's in cahoots with God in lots of stories, like the story of Job, for example. The shadow, in a sense, is depicted very often as an aspect of the wider picture. And then the anima animus, as we mentioned last time, the attractive other, helps us balance out over specializations, helps us to recognize the wider potential of our whole psyche, our whole experience. And as we integrate the anima animus, we're gradually probably distinguishing less between the other, which is attracting us, and ourselves. It becomes more of a general development in which those boundaries begin to become less important. So again, we're gradually developing the attractive other into something that's not other anymore, but it's just bigger us, if you like, as well as bigger other. So that's why the God archetype kicks in. Obviously, there it's not helpful to see God just as other. God archetype is just as other. God archetype is also you. And indeed, Jung called the God archetype, one of his other name for it was the self with a capital S. So the rest of this talk, I'm going to say more about the function of the God archetype, the breadth of the possible symbols we can encounter for it or use for it, the ways it's projected and the ways of avoiding, possible ways of avoiding that projection, at least briefly, and the ways it's integrated. So let's start with the function of the God archetype. So what does it do? I think it inspires us, like all the other archetypes, but it inspires us particularly to connect with new and open potentiality. So if it closes us down in some way, if it gets us to fight a holy war, for example, then it's not doing the job of the God archetype. It's gone awry somewhere. It's that edge of openness in experience. I think it was Paul Tillich who called God the open dimension of being. So that's quite a good way to nail it, perhaps. So it's and the God archetype is on the edge of our understanding and beyond our expectations. So it can be surprising, can turn up unexpected things, can certainly challenge us. It can be awe-inspiring. So awe is a very common emotion in response to symbols of the God archetype. Like one of the classic examples of that is the awe of the Israelites at Mount Sinai, and seeing the feet of God on the top of Mount Sinai, and feeling a sense of danger in the encounter. So yeah, we form a sense of the meaning of the God archetype from what we can broadly call religious experience. Maybe people will prefer other titles in some cases, like spiritual experience or sublime experience, but I tend to call it religious experience, but I have quite a wide understanding of that term. So there's a spectrum of what you could call religious experiences, but they connect us with a wider potentiality, a wider sense of what could be the case. Now, let me see if I can share the diagram with you, which helps to show that spread of religious experiences. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, this shows up like a spectrum of experiences from ordinary concentration, which I imagine is probably what you're in now, unless you're distracted by something. But there's a little bit of neuroscience in this kind of descriptions of what might probably going on in your brain, but also how we might experience it. So the task positive network is operating. But we're driven by goals, explicitly or implicitly, but we're dependent on immediate stimuli to respond to those stimuli. So that's normal if we're at least reasonably focused. But then there's these what are often called flow states, which were written about by this unpronounceable Czech psychologist called or something like that. I probably pronounced it wrongly. But in his view, his idea of flow, which has become quite well established, it's an idea of stable and fairly integrated states in which the left and right hemispheres are obviously working well together, but there's still some sort of conceptualized goals and stimuli going on. So if you're engaged in some sort of creative work and it's really flowing, maybe you're painting a picture or writing something, you may get into a flow state where it seems to be a very clear creative direction, and you are inspired to a certain point. And then we can talk about mindful states such as jhana in Buddhism, where we're no longer dependent on immediate external stimuli. So we might, for example, start off concentrating on the breath, and then It's almost like the breath takes over, or our awareness of the breath takes over, and it becomes autonomous and stable in itself, and we become really interested in that simple sensation. And at that point, we really, things like craving and anxiety, if there are any of them left, drop away, and you get what Buddhism calls the jhana factors. So you start to get a much more temporarily integrated state. Now, I think that's roughly a description of all sorts of, not only meditative states, but also perhaps sublime states that artists might write about, for instance. And then the furthest end of the spectrum is full-on religious experience, as you might call it. Yeah. So when you're really intensely taken over by some sort of vision, for instance, or some sort of complete change in your state. And that seems to be associated with stimulation of the temporal lobe, which unifies your experiences much more intensely. You'll probably have intense ecstatic feelings, a sense of profound insights, and you may well get deep equanimity or sudden breakthroughs in your experience. Okay, so that's the spectrum of what I'm talking about when I say religious experience, just to give you some sense of that. Okay, so now I think in order to get some sense of the meaning of the God archetype, we need to connect it in some way to religious experience, not necessarily to full-on ecstasy, but to somewhere on that spectrum. And it does seem that nearly everybody has experienced things on that spectrum. Perhaps not absolutely everybody, but there's a guy called David Hay who did research into religious experiences going back, I think, to the 1980s. And he did interviews with people asking when they first had a religious experience. Now, of course, there's always an issue of how you define a religious experience. I think he talked about a feeling of a presence or power, which is a bit vague and a bit possibly metaphysical. But anyway, he gives us some idea how many people have had religious experiences. In his interview, he found 62% of people reported that they'd had some sort of religious experience of that kind. So I take that just as an indication, really, that this is part of the human condition. Religious experience isn't this funny, weird thing that only a few people have. And that also means that, well, you really don't have to interpret it metaphysically, and that's the big problem with the way religious experience is generally discussed. The idea that it's proof of the existence of God and all that kind of stuff. So not only is it not proof of the existence of God, but also it's not essentially linked to any beliefs about God or any other absolute beliefs at all. It's an experience, and it's a really important and meaningful experience. So it's not diminished at all by us refraining from interpreting it in absolute ways. It doesn't give us a hotline to absolute truth of any kind, but that doesn't stop it being incredibly important. And there's a phrase in the Buddhist tradition, in the Buddhist scripture called the Sutta Nikata, a very nice short phrase, in the sea and with the sea, which really sums up that attitude to me. So the idea, when you have an experience, okay, that's an experience. Just stop there. Appreciate that experience for what it is, but for the meaning that experience has for you. Yeah, so it's quite possible to appreciate religious experience as perhaps the basis of appreciation of the God archetype without believing in God or anything else. So the interaction between religious experience and the God archetype like all meaning, is associative. Yeah, so we associate symbols of the God archetype with religious experiences. It's almost like, well, the God archetype, when it's being helpful anyway, comes to mean those religious experiences. It triggers those religious experiences, or some sort of at least memory of them or connection with them before us. So by doing that, it gives us power. So it gives the symbols power to continue inspiring us. So maybe that we revisit a more integrated mental state, at least to some extent, by contemplating the symbol, if we can build up those associations, plus those helpful associations with it. Okay, so that's how the God archetype basically can function, I think, for the individual. Now, but of course, a lot of the stuff to do with God archetype is social. So symbols of the God archetype can also have an integrative effect socially by bringing people together, if you like. But I think that works in exactly the same way as it does for the individual. So we have awareness of a new potential, but it's a shared awareness, and we connect on the basis of that awareness. So when people talk about, the power of spiritual community, for example, connecting with other people who are inspired in the same way, then I think the God archetype symbols often become part of that. This social aspect of the God archetype, I think, can mislead us in a number of ways. So one is, I think, that we need to make some sort of distinction between that shared awareness, which is about solidarity in inspiration, if you like, and group hysteria, for lack of a better term. So group hysteria is really sort of shared absolutization, where everybody in a group has got the same maybe excited state with an absolute idea or absolute belief dominant, leading that state, but also leading the emotions that focus that state. So you see that in some of the hysterical states that people get into in Pentecostalism, for example, or the Toronto blessing that swept evangelical churches a few decades ago. Or politically, you think about something like the Nuremberg rally, what sort of states people, excited, groupie states people get into. And that may well be in connection with symbols which are beginning to play that role for them, even if they're political symbols. So that's one kind of problematic area you can get into, and another one is the reductive approach to this. So social scientists, I often find, unnecessarily reduce the integrative effects of the God archetype, of religious worship or religious faith, or whatever you want to call it. They reduce that to a mere social function, which isn't to say it doesn't have social functions, but if they say, well, it's just a way of binding the group, then that suggests that religion has to always be interpreted dogmatically, that it's always basically just a group binding function. So obviously I disagree with that profoundly. And it's a shame, given all the insights that social scientists have in religion, I've got a lot from them, that they keep making this assumption and don't seem capable of re-examining. So that's all about the functions of the God archetype. Now, the next section then is to talk a bit about symbols and the breadth of possible symbols we could relate to for the God archetype. So here I could show you a few pictures again. Let's start off with most obvious one, which you've probably already thought of. So here's Michelangelo's famous Old Man in the Sky, in the process of creating the earth. God, but I mean, if you're going to have an old man in the sky, then it's a pretty good old man in the sky, I think. It's on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But let's look at some less obvious, slightly less obvious gods. This one I think is rather good. So this challenges the obviously the stereotypes, projections about God, but we still got the throne, so we still got all the accoutrements of something we're focusing on and finding important, that we're reminded to seek within ourselves instead. But there we're still kind of expecting the old man in the sky, aren't we, to be sitting on the throne. But perhaps there are also depictions, more traditional depictions, which do give you a sense of the inspirational effects of God. So this is a picture by Caravaggio, late Renaissance, of the inspiration of Matthew. And obviously, if you interpret this very, very literally, it's, you know, the angel is telling Matthew exactly what to write in his gospel. But you can also see this as a depiction of inspiration, and it is called the inspiration of Matthew. So not that Matthew is being told the exact words to write, but he's getting something which he connects with, which inspires him, and then that state leads him to try and communicate things to other people. And in that sense, there's something archetypal, I think, about that picture. Okay, but if we're trying to get beyond old men in the sky, even with empty thrones, then we could get on to other kinds of symbols of the God archetype. So the Buddha is another obvious symbol. So to say that the Buddha can operate as a God archetype is just to say the image can inspire us in the same way. It's not to make theological equivalencies. People will immediately jump in with all the differences between the Buddha and God, focusing here on the ways these archetypes function. So obviously, you know, if you're inspired by Buddha figures, the Buddha may be a way for you to connect with open potential. Very often for Buddhists it is. Of course, there's also the wise old man archetype, which Jung talked about. I've got a great example of that. I'll just find it in a moment. Here we are. Yeah, so the wise old man is often, for instance, a guru or a wizard. There we go. Yeah, I thought this was a great one. So this is Merlin from the BBC series. But something about his gesture there and his severity gets across the wise old man. But there are lots of figures in stories and mythology which have that effect. But yeah, if they've all been male so far, then obviously this symbol could just as easily be female. Even if depictions of it are rather less common. But here's one which I rather like. So this is a photo by a photographer called Ferdinand Reyes, just called The Wise Old Woman. So So where we took it, I don't know, somewhere in Africa probably, but it's just, it does seem to capture something about that person, which could have that kind of a function for us. So obviously there are also goddesses and taras and female bodhisattvas and so on. So lots of options there. Now, so those are some of the most obvious religious or mythological kinds of symbols, but there are also, you find these in the last section of my book, Archetypes in Religion and Beyond. I talk about conceptual symbols of the God archetype, which are sometimes maybe called secular symbols of the God archetype, because people maybe regard them as secular. And so people tend to connect with those much more as concepts. So if you think about terms like nature, goodness, truth, humanity, beauty, even rationality and democracy, I think very often the recollection of those terms, just the concepts can inspire people. They can stand in people's minds for something that keep motivating them, perhaps in their political struggles or their other goals, maybe helping others or whatever they're doing, maybe trying to save the world. So yeah, that would apply to the first one of those a lot. Obviously, the term nature. So nature, when you start examining it as a sort of serious concept, is very tricky indeed, because you can make it mean almost anything, but it can operate archetypally as an inspiration, and often has. So in Chinese religions, for example, you've got the terms Li and Dao, for example, which mean something quite similar to nature. You've got nature in paganism or Wicca, and you've got nature in science. So the idea that science is investigating nature, trying to find the mysteries of how things are. And providing scientists don't think they've actually got total reality in their theories as represent how things actually are, then that inspiration may be very helpful to you. So that's the distinction really between being inspired by nature and thinking you've captured nature in your butterfly net. So yeah, a couple more pictures actually, just to show that those sorts of conceptual symbols can also be made visual. Yeah, so these two pictures are reproduced in my book as well. So this is truth showing a mirror to the illusions of the world. It's a picture you'll find in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. So you can see we've got this severe female figure with the scales for weighing things up, skull for death, and the mirror showing to us, and the book, of course. I mean, alternative allegories of truth are often naked figures, and they talk about naked truth. So being inspired by this sort of conception of truth, I think, is a bit different from claiming to know the truth, which is a much trickier thing. But you can hold back from claiming to know the truth, but at the same time be inspired by truth. And I think many scientists and journalists, for example, are inspired by truth in that way. And another final one, which again is in the section of my book. So this is a statue representing humanity in Prague, the Czech Republic. So, I mean, this is obviously about solidarity and the links between people, making those embodied and concrete. But at the same time, it's an archetypal idea, and so it stands for something that may inspire us. We may come back to it. So perhaps people doing medical work, for example, may be inspired by some sort of ideal of humanity, humanitarian work, humanitarian mission. Okay, so that's just a taste of a range of symbols. Now, I think for any of those symbols to work for us as symbols of the God archetype, then they need to have some sort of openness about them. And often that takes the form of some element of infinity somewhere. So I don't mean infinity in a particularly sort of analyzed sense, such as philosophers get carried away with, but just as the experience of something that's not resolved, that's open. So finite literally means having boundaries. Infinity doesn't have boundaries. So in our experience, something that doesn't have boundaries is infinite. So often these symbols need to have some sort of something infinite in them. It could be obviously God is infinite in his classical description, and I think that's appropriate for the meaning of what God might mean to us archetypally. So you could say the same about any of these other possible symbols. Nature is infinite, truth is infinite, and so on. So yeah, they go beyond us in their universality, perhaps, or in the kind of awareness they demand of us. Truth is always running ahead of us in some way. Okay, so if we are inspired in this way by a relationship with symbols, God archetype, then there's the ever-present danger of projection. So I need to talk a bit about projection before we go back to finally to the business of integrating God archetype. So you have to admit that the God archetype is overwhelmingly projected in most religious traditions, a lot of the time. The God archetype is also projected in reactions against religious traditions. So typically atheism in the sense of disbelief in God or denial of God, for instance. So when we project the God archetype, we cease to take responsibility for our role in developing new potential. That new potential involves us. It's part of our experience and our process in developing that potential, whether individually or collectively. So when you project it, instead you see it as some sort of being or power that's beyond you in that sense. So that often does take the form of seeing God as supernatural. So that's a kind of shortcut way of talking about it, perhaps, that God as supernatural is a projection of God. But if instead of that you think of God as natural instead of supernatural, then that doesn't necessarily solve the projection problem. So there's a philosophical view known as deism, which became popular in the 18th century, which tried to just explain God in terms of natural processes. That God was the universe, effectively. So God was everywhere, but that he didn't create the universe separately. So sort of naturalized God. But that can still be a projected God. So you can still fail to take responsibility for the meaning of that God in your own experience. So it's not whether it's supernatural or natural that necessarily makes the difference, but often supernaturalism is a sign of projection. Of course, you can also change the symbol. So an mistake it's easy to make to say, well, let's stop calling it God, let's call it something else, and then we'll stop projecting it. But it doesn't always follow. So you can dismiss one symbol, and then because you're in the habit of projecting onto that symbol, not taking responsibility for it, then you let another one in by the back door. So if you don't like God anymore, then you can start to believe in rationality, for example. You believe that rationality is universally present beyond us and beyond our experience. You can be a Platonist, in other words. Or you can believe that nature is in charge and all will be for the best because nature will inevitably balance itself. Maybe it's Mother Nature, maybe it's just nature. So yeah, that's another kind of projection which could substitute easily for God. So yeah, projection can happen in all kinds of ways, and yeah, the key thing that they have in common, I think, is this loss of responsibility. Really. So the projected God archetype usually ends up with all sorts of developed, detailed rationalizations of itself, yeah, which are, well, a lot of theology, traditional theology anyway, supposed to be critical theology, metaphysics, metaphysical philosophy. Just to give you a quick taste of these sorts of arguments, so God is seen as necessarily existent, for example. So just through having the idea of God in our minds, therefore there must be such a God. So that's what's known as the ontological argument for the existence of God. It's obviously completely certified, completely self-justifying. Or the idea that God is necessary before everything else. So you've got to assume God before you can assume anything else. Or you can have circular justifications for God. So we find evidence of God in Scripture, and then Scriptures tell us about the authority of the Church, and the Church then decided what went into the Scriptures. So you've got a circularity of justification. Or you can have infinite rationalizations of God and what God knows. So for example, God is always compatible with any amount of evil because God knows why that evil is present, even if to us it seems absolutely unspeakable. And so the needless suffering of innocent children, for example, is a classic one. But God knows in his wisdom why innocent children suffer, so we don't need to worry about that. So you can carry on infinitely rationalizing your absolute belief. And there's the inflation of what God is supposed to be doing, or what the belief in God is supposed to be doing. So the idea that it's necessary to morality to believe in God, that's also very common in theists. So atheists must be immoral because they're not theists, they don't believe in God. And that starts with the sort of inflated view of what the belief itself must do. So all of these are kind of defense mechanisms. They're intellectual defense mechanisms, which have become surprisingly common in the ways that people talk about God, or indeed you can often find traces of them in other ways of talking about other symbols of the God archetype as well. So look out for them when talking about nature, for instance. But yeah, the clearest examples of it are found in theology. So to avoid all these rationalized traps that have been set up, if you like, to keep projection supporting itself, what we need is the practice of agnosticism. So by agnosticism, I mean practice of remaining even-handed between opposing absolute beliefs, not getting sucked into that dualism, not getting sucked into either of those two pretenders either side. So I'm not going to go into great detail about agnosticism now, but in the new series, in the 5 Principles series, which will be next, I'll have a couple of sessions on agnosticism, and there's a lot to say about it. But just briefly for now, I mean, agnosticism is often wrongly portrayed as indecisive or cowardly. Again, I think that's part of the defense mechanism, because agnosticism is actually a much bigger threat to absolute belief than atheism is, for example. And then there's all this stuff about hard and soft agnosticism, you know, so so-called hard agnosticism, which comes to terms with us not being able to know absolute things, is, I think, absolutely actually more provisional than so-called soft agnosticism. But the way the world uses those terms gets them the other way around. So you immediately get accused of being rigid if you adopt a hard agnostic position. So there are lots of traps and tricks which we could get into there. I won't get into them anymore now, but we will explore them later. I think because unfortunately we do need to be aware of these, to be wary to some extent if we're trying to practice the other way. Okay, so let's get into positive stuff then. So God archetype, how do we integrate the God archetype? If we can avoid projecting it, if we can avoid at worst believing in the old man in the sky as a thing out there, how do we engage helpfully with the God archetype or with whichever symbols we are using for the God archetype? Well, if we integrate the God archetype, it should be resolving conflict rather than creating it. So if it's projected, well, one immediate alarm signal, I think, if it's projected, it may well be being projected, is if it starts creating more conflict, whether within ourselves or with other people. And that's where the practice of agnosticism becomes very tricky, because one needs to maintain a critical perspective without getting into needless conflict. Nevertheless, I think resolute agnosticism is a starting point for integrating the God archetype. Otherwise, it's easy to get stuck with the projection, unable to examine the projection or just reaction against it into another projection, into the opposite. So to integrate God archetype, we may need to start off by just resolutely not getting involved in fighting over the symbols. You know, that it's actually the archetype, and however its meaning gets communicated to us, however we engage with it, that's important. So then you need to find the symbol that works for you. Now, it would be nice if we could just sort of select one from a list or whatever, but it's obviously not entirely independent of our backgrounds or our social context. Some things will be meaningful to us because of our backgrounds and so on. So Christian symbols have a much bigger effect on me than Buddhist ones, for example, because I come from a Christian background, I think. And also because I come from a Western cultural background and I love art and stuff like this, and Renaissance art particularly. So all these things give me an entry point, if you like, into symbols of the God archetype through God, or symbols of God. But that may not work for you at all, I appreciate it. But it is likely that some sort of God archetype symbol will already inspire you, even if you actually hate God as such, or a symbol of God. So maybe a female image, maybe a Buddha, maybe an idea of nature, whatever it is, but you need to work it out for yourself. But one reason for engaging with God as an explicit symbol is just the massive set of cultural resources available related to God. Yeah, so particularly from the arts, which are available to inspire you. And that's just really a cornucopia, I think, once you start getting into it. Once you start looking at all this music and art and poetry and so on, which is about God, and try and start interpreting it positively, that for me was a real opening in my experience. So just by interpreting it with meaning. But associating the symbol with a source of inspiration is very much a matter of practice. I think it needs to be integrated with practices. So those practices might include, well, obviously the arts, whether that's appreciating the arts or creating them. It might include meditation, might include visualization of figures, if some people find that much easier than others. I was talking recently to Hannah, who's in the Middle Way Society, about this. She's an amazing visualizer, so she's very different from me. I find that quite difficult, but visualization can really inspire some people. Contemplation, so letting an idea or a symbol percolate through your experience. And then there's the question of prayer. So is prayer a helpful practice? My kind of quick stab at trying to answer that is, depends on a distinction. Yeah, so I think there's a distinction between prayer as a kind of open practice, contemplative prayer, perhaps, as Christians might describe it, where you're just opening yourself to God, probably in a wordless way, and petitionary prayer. So petitionary prayer seems to be very wrapped up in not only God as a supernatural entity, but also having particular expectations that God will fix this or that for you, which takes you straight back into not taking responsibility. So prayer could well be a way into open contemplative prayer, could well be a way into engaging with God. That's a route that helps you. Another one, engagement in green environments. I hesitate to say nature, which is how people often express this, but immersing yourself in nature, in inverted commas, or something that's not too human, that's has lots of plants in it, or maybe wild environments. And that again can be a trigger, can be an association with the God archetype. You may just see it in an open, or experience it in an open landscape, for example. So don't forget what I mentioned earlier, also that the three functional archetypes, the other three functional archetypes, also provide ways into the God archetypes. So you might encounter new potential through goals, through working with goals, through working with relationships, or with your response to threats. Okay, and then probably the final point in relation to integrating God archetype is religious rituals. So again, that's been a very interesting process for me to find ways of working with religious rituals, which I haven't personally always had particularly positive relationships with, whether they're Christian or Buddhist. But for me, it seems the important thing is to find positive but agnostic ways of relating to them, and to put those two things together, so that there's no reason why we shouldn't find it increasingly meaningful, and have that critical awareness there, but it's there in the background. You don't have to foreground it too much, so it doesn't have to stop blocking your appreciation, your meaningful appreciation of the symbols. So to start with, if you're not used to doing that, it may be necessary to keep consciously reminding yourself of an archetypal interpretation. Something like, this is about you. this hymn that people are singing about God on his throne, like this is the archetype that I'm responsible for. And maybe if you keep reminding yourself about that, you can start relating to it differently without losing your critical perspective. At least that's my experience, that it is possible to do that. I'd be interested to hear other people's experiences. Okay, that's probably enough for now. So let's open this up to questions, and I'll say a little bit later on about a practice focus. That's some general questions or responses for now.
I want to have used the term, and I think you suggested this, a potentiality archetype instead of the God archetype. And I do, because it says to me very much what I think as a child I thought God was. I think that idea of new potentiality is something that I can feel close to and very inspired by. Whereas the idea of God in the religions that I was involved with were always projected ideas. The thing I was thinking about, when you talked about the infinity of God, of the God archetype or the potentiality archetype, I really like that. And it's as if there's always something about it that you can't quite nail down the meaning of this openness. And anyway, that's something that I think is, to me, is very important as a kind of sign of what this archetype is. It escapes, in a way, that kind of closedness. Anyway, and the other question, that was a comment. The question I had was, you had said at the beginning that the God archetype tends to take over the other archetypes as integration takes place. And I wonder if you could talk about the anima, animus archetype, how, as that is more integrated, you come closer to the God archetype. Now that I'm saying that, I think you said that you take more responsibility for the other, for being the other, and draw that otherness within oneself. Is that what goes on? Okay.
That's right, yes. So if you think about, a very projected relationship with the other, so like you fall in love with somebody and put them on a pedestal, and they've got all these things which aren't you, which you want to appropriate. And then if you were to integrate that instead, then you perhaps gradually begin to recognize that it's you who's got these emotions, and this other person has has qualities of their own which are much more complex and part of a bigger picture. And so getting to grips with that bigger picture is, if you like, it's moving beyond your over intense focus just on that one other person. And it's also in the taking responsibility for your own responses is putting you into the picture. So it's not just about the other anymore, it's also about you and changing you and changing your responses. So you're getting into a wider potentiality there, gradually, from just to focus on the other as other to
what strikes me right as you're speaking about this, what's so helpful about this archetype is the adaptability it gives to you. You know, you are able to be open and undefined or unbounded in the way that you have been otherwise. And the potentiality allows you to explore things like staying in the middle way, instead of being caught up in, I don't know, it just strikes me as something really helpful in a way that I haven't seen it when I've thought of this as God in the religious, limited religious way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in terms of staying in the middle way, I'll talk more about that in the final session next. So ways that we might want to symbolize the middle way directly.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts from anybody else? George?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. It's a really interesting area. One of the points I'd like to just explore a little bit, or like you to explore a little bit more, maybe, is this edge, this boundary where you're stepping into the unknown, or there's no clear way forward or definition, and the relationship of that to trust or faith. And how having that trust in being in that space, or the confidence to be in that kind of space where you don't know, seems really interesting to me. And the counter to that might be falling into a kind of deterministic way of looking at things, in the way that you trust that it has to work out in a certain way because it's destined. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between these two dynamics.
Okay, I mean, this connects a lot with provisionality, which again I'll go into in depth in the next series. But particularly, I think considering more options, considering more possibilities, and being open to more possibilities, is what gives us, well, more adaptability, more ability to adapt to different conditions, and more creativity. So we've got more possibilities to select from. So we're not so much restricted by our previous habits and conditioning and so on. That's where we can. You can think of the God archetype as a prompt to provisionality, perhaps, if it helps to put us in touch with new possibilities, and obviously that also relates strongly to the imagination, and the ability to conceive and explore those new possibilities. Again, beyond the habitual, beyond the things that we actually believe in. There was another dimension of your question which I'm raising now. Can you come back to me?
Yeah, just the sort of deterministic way of looking at things. I think a lot of people really want to have that confidence about being in something that's different, or feeling the sense that their experience is enlarged in some kind of way, and more complex and exciting, or possibilities are opening up for them. And it's just the flip side of that. If you really start to have a strong faith that it's always going to work out, is you can fall into a deterministic kind of view. And what are ways that help you to avoid that? Or is that sometimes maybe a positive thing? Just some thoughts on that.
No, I mean, I think determinism is a metaphysical absolute assumption, and so it limits our understanding of the options we have, or the options that others have. mean, there's complexity in that, but I won't go into that now. But it's interesting that you mentioned trust and faith, because I think they're very relevant here, aren't they? Because there's another dimension to trust and faith, which is confidence, which is something that comes from our bodies, I think. So we're used to operating in particular ways, and we get more confident in a very immediate sense with those ways. So you know, we learn how to ride a bicycle, for example, or how to use a brush or whatever. We can do those things, and we don't think about them as we're doing them. We have a certain intuitive flow in the way that we use them. So when we combine that, I think that faith or trust or confidence with creativity, with that openness to new possibilities, then we're much more likely to be able to use those, to engage with those new possibilities in the most helpful way. But obviously that depends not just on the imagination, not just on having the range of options, but also being able to critically weigh up what the best option is and make a practical judgment about it, which is, you know, there's another skill set involved there, which again I'll go into in the next series more. Yeah, so that's where I'd make a distinction between faith and belief. At least I think it's a helpful distinction to make, that absolute belief, particularly as it's often discussed in religious terms, is, you know, it's just a rational imposition which restricts you to think in a particular way. But faith, on the other hand, can be, if it's sufficiently embodied, it can be a way actually of being more adaptable and more imaginative, but having confidence in that imagination, that way of operating. So I think at best, the idea of having, I can even make sense of the idea of having faith in God without having belief in God. Yeah, so having faith in God would be having a confident relationship with the inspiration offered by that archetype. So that's the distinction I was trying to make. It's in the subtitle of my book, Christian Middle Way, which was against Christian belief but for Christian faith. And it's all based really on that idea that you could have an embodied and provisional faith, and that you can see that in religious terms, operating in the best of religious faith, I think. But that's a very different thing from absolute belief. Your thoughts?
I had related to what you were talking about, George. I was thinking at the beginning of your question, when you talked about people moving into the unknown, moving into something where they don't know, and that a belief in God, belief in the sense that you're talking about, Robert, can give people a certain confidence when they're in situations where everything is at risk. And I think when I think of the God archetype as a potentiality that you engage with, you develop confidence through that engagement of being in the unknown, taking a risk, it working out or not, but learning from it. so that you can fold that back into your sense of potentiality. It's almost a, well, I mean, this is what you're saying using the word God, but it's as if the potentiality is what protects you in the unknown, that you get a kind of confidence that is protective in that way from this archetype. It's helpful in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I saw a news article just a day or two ago now, which I shared on Facebook, which is it's about some research showing that involvement in religious faith, as they described it, leads to better health outcomes. And so apparently it's pretty good statistics showing this. But it's also interesting, I think, that the researchers in that article ascribed those health benefits to not to absolutely religious belief, but to engagement with the community and the kind of social security gives you, but also the meaningfulness of that concept.
It's interesting.
So I mean, that was in the, I think it was in the Guardian maybe a couple of days ago. So if you want to, you can probably find that article if you research.
I'll look for that.
It occurs to me that it might be something to do with simply going beyond oneself in itself, regardless as to, I mean, you've given us many different options about God archetypes and symbols, but it's the just going beyond our small self in itself. That is, for me, at the moment, it occurs to me that that's an operative thing. That's a significant thing in itself, a step to take. Well, you've mentioned about going into the unknown, so it's connected to that. And I'm thinking about an example of going for my first COVID vaccine when I really was very, very anxious about it and had a lot of questions in the hospital to the nurse and then another person and then the doctor, and I had loads and loads of questions and was searching and searching for reassurance that it was the right thing to do to have the vaccine. And it was at the end of all that when I asked, or they told me anyway, that how many people were going to have it, and that all the medical staff had it, and it was that sense of how heroic everybody was. That they'd all gone ahead of me and they'd all done that, taken that leap, that flicked that switch for me into, right, that's it, I've made my decision, I'm having it. You know what I mean? It was, yeah, the unification with others that yeah,
I mean,
that gave me that faith, in a greater beingness or something.
Yeah, I mean, you can talk about going beyond yourself, which might mean an idea of oneself, but it's obviously also an idea of other things around us, which we might identify with a sort of smaller version of them or a more habitual version of them. But it takes courage and openness to move on to a wider one, to consider wider possibilities. And sometimes that's required to listen to arguments, isn't it? So like somebody's putting forward something that may be quite well evidenced scientifically, for example, but you don't want to accept it for some reason.
But it was that greater purpose and courage of that unified courage of people that, kind of.
Okay. Well, it sounds like it might be connected to the hero archetype, do you think?
I'm not sure. Maybe.
Or hero turning into the god archetype.
Yeah.
But if the main thing is if you're inspired, so you had that effect on you. Okay, well, we're running short of time here, so I better just go on to talk about the practice focus a bit. So yeah, as usual, I will put my notes in the Slack area. So what I think I'll do this time is just ask you 5 questions, which are about, well, the practice focus, which is to maintain wider inspiration without projection. So in some ways, this is a recapitulation of previous sessions, but it's bringing it together a bit, and particularly in relation to the God archetype. So I'll ask you 5 questions, and I'll make a little pause between each one, just to give you a bit of time to consider it, and then I will put my notes on the Slack area so you can look at those questions again later. Okay, so first one. So what experiences of open potential do you have that have been or could be associated with the God archetype, or whatever you want to call it? So what experiences of open potential do you have that have been or could be associated with God archetype? Okay, second question. So what symbols already have the function of the God archetype in you? Okay, so you might start considering this from the point of view of your experiences. If you remember the spectrum of religious experiences, you have experiences like that, you can relate to a symbol. That could be one approach. But the second one will be, well, what already evokes that kind of experience of openness for you? And then the third question, could you widen those symbols or develop a more positive relationship with the symbols used by others, for example, in religion and the arts? So, for instance, if you don't currently have a positive relationship with the symbol God, could you possibly cultivate one, or would that be a waste of time? It could be a waste of time, but it might be worth considering. Or there might be other symbols that you might find it helpful to cultivate, as it were. Fourth question. Can you engage critically, but even-handedly, with the projection of those symbols, without rejecting the symbols themselves and their role in others' experience? So that might lead you to reflect a bit on well, what your experience is of maybe critical conversations about maybe religious issues. Can you be even-handed in your approach to those conversations? And then final question, well, not really a question, but final point. Find a symbol of the God archetype you can focus on and keep returning to recall its inspiring associations. So if you want to try and cultivate a relationship to the God archetype, then you'll need to find a symbol that works, that you can focus on. Okay, so we've out of time, but any final questions or points?